I poured every cent I had into my husband's dream restaurant, $490,000, and when the grand opening night finally came, he told me it was invitation only. I wasn't on the list. I still remember standing in our kitchen when he said it. I had just gotten home from work, still in my blazer, hair pinned back, and he was on his phone scrolling through what I later found out was the seating chart. I asked him what time we should leave for the opening. He didn't even look up. "It's a private event, Mia. Close circle only. You'd be uncomfortable anyway. It's mostly investors and their wives." I laughed, actually laughed, because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Let me back up because this didn't start on that night. This started 3 years earlier in a tiny apartment in Austin where my husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, legally, on paper, even if what he did wasn't anything a husband does, sat across from me at our kitchen table with a napkin covered in sketches and numbers and told me about his dream. He wanted to open a fine dining restaurant, farm to table, seasonal menu, the kind of place that gets written up in local magazines and has a 3-week wait list. He had the vision. He had the vision. He had the passion. What he didn't have was money. I did. I was 31. I had spent my 20s working in commercial real estate, long hours, difficult clients, a lot of weekends sacrificed. I wasn't rich by any stretch, but I had saved carefully, invested early, and by the time we got married, I had built up a nest egg that most people my age only dreamed about. My mother always told me to keep my finances separate from a man's until you truly knew who he was. I thought I knew. I'd been with him for 4 years before we got married. I thought 4 years was enough time to know a person. I said yes. I told him I believed in him, and I wrote the checks. The first transfer was $200,000. That covered the lease deposit on a space in a converted warehouse downtown, exposed brick, good bones, the kind of place that photographs beautifully. He was so excited that night. We stayed up until 2 in the morning talking about the menu, the name, the lighting. He held my hands across the table and said, "This wouldn't exist without you. You know that, right?" I know that now means something different than I thought it did then. Over the next 18 months, there were more transfers, equipment, staff, a build-out that went over budget twice, a consultant he hired without telling me who charged $15,000 for brand strategy. Each time I hesitated, he had a reason. Each time I asked to see the books, something came up, a meeting, a call. He promised to show me this weekend, but then the weekend came and went. He wasn't hiding anything, he said. He was just overwhelmed. Launching a restaurant is hard, he said. I needed to trust him. I trusted him. By the time the restaurant, Ember, he called it, was ready to open, I had put in $480,000. Nearly everything I had saved. What I kept back was enough to cover my own expenses for about 8 months, tucked away in an account he didn't know about. My mother's voice in my head, even after I'd stopped listening to her everywhere else. He told me the opening was scheduled for a Friday in March. I circled it on my calendar. I bought a dress. Deep burgundy, fitted, the kind of dress you wear when you want to feel like you belong somewhere. I made a salon appointment. I called my best friend, Cassie, and told her to save the date because I wanted her there when my husband's restaurant opened. Our restaurant. That's how I thought of it. 3 days before the opening, he sat me down. "I need to talk to you about Friday." I assumed it was a logistical thing. Maybe the time had changed. Maybe there was a private dinner before the public opening and he wanted to prep me. The opening is a ticketed event. Press, a few local food bloggers, the investors who back the final phase. It's a very controlled environment. My publicist thinks it'll be better if we keep the guest list tight. I waited. "I don't think you should come." I heard the words. I understood them grammatically, but they didn't land right away. It took a full 3 seconds before I said, "I'm sorry, it's not personal. It's just, you get anxious in crowds, and I'll be working the room all night. I won't be able to pay attention to you, and I don't want you to feel neglected." That was his reason, that I get anxious in crowds. I, who had negotiated $1 million commercial leases in rooms full of people who didn't want to give me anything. I, who had spent $480,000 of my own money on that very room we were talking about. "I funded this restaurant," I said, very quietly. "I know that," he said. "And I'm grateful. But tonight isn't about money. It's about the vision. And I need to be fully present. Can you just trust me on this? There it was again. Trust me. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Something in me went very still, the way it does sometimes right before you understand that a situation is much more serious than you initially thought. I told him I needed to think. He seemed relieved by that, which told me everything. I called Cassie that night. She came over with wine and I told her everything, the money, the dress, that you get anxious in crowds. She sat on my couch and stared at me. Mia, she said, who else is going to that opening? I didn't know. That's what I realized in that moment. I had been so absorbed in funding and managing my own emotions that I hadn't asked a single question about who was actually on that guest list. Cassie pulled up the restaurant's Instagram. Ember had an account. I'd known that, but I hadn't been following it closely. The feed was beautiful. Moody photography, close-up shots of dishes, golden light. And in the stories, there were countdown posts. Guest previews. Photos captioned pre-opening dinner from 2 nights ago that I had known nothing about. There was a woman in 2 of the photos, standing next to my husband, laughing at something he'd said. I recognized her. She was the brand consultant, the one who'd charged $15,000 and that I'd never actually met. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I did something I should have done 18 months earlier. I called my attorney. Her response was Sir Germany, and she's the kind of woman who speaks in complete sentences and never raises her voice, and somehow still makes you feel like the ground is shifting under the other person's feet. I told her everything, the transfers, the missing financial records, the opening I'd been excluded from, the woman in the photos. Helen asked me one question. Is any of this in writing? Some of it was. The original investment conversation we had documented loosely, a simple letter of agreement that I had insisted on and he had signed, mostly to placate me, I think. It named me as a primary financial contributor with equity interest. It wasn't perfect legal language, but it was something. That's enough to start, Helen said. Don't go to that opening, don't confront him tonight, just give me 24 hours. I spent Friday night at Cassie's. I wore the burgundy dress anyway because I'd bought it, and I wasn't going to let it hang in my closet like a reminder. We ordered Thai food and she put on a movie and I sat on her couch feeling like I was watching my own life from the outside. My husband texted at 9:47 p.m. Opening was incredible. Wish you could have been here. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down. What I found out in the following days was worse than I'd imagined. Helen had a forensic accountant contact she trusted, and between the documents I could access and the ones she formally requested, a picture emerged. The $480,000 I had contributed had been partially absorbed by legitimate startup costs, the lease, the equipment, the build-out. But somewhere along the way, a significant chunk had been redirected. A line of credit had been taken out using the restaurant as collateral. My husband had signed documents and my name, as a co-signer on that credit line. I had never signed anything. I had never been presented with anything to sign. My signature, on legal financial documents, was forged. When Helen told me, I sat in her office and for a long moment I couldn't speak. Not because I was falling apart. Because I was doing math. I was calculating how long he had been planning this, and how much of what I'd believed about my marriage was real, and whether those 2 numbers would ever match up. They didn't. I had to make a choice. I could confront him in anger and tip my hand, or I could be very calm and very smart and let the legal process do what it was designed to do. Helen was clear. If I moved carefully, I had grounds for fraud, forgery, and potentially more. I also had equity interest in the restaurant by virtue of that original letter. I chose to be calm. He came home the night after the opening still buzzing with it. He talked for 20 minutes about the reviews, the press, the energy in the room. I sat at the kitchen table and listened and nodded, and at one point I said, "It sounds like it was everything you wanted." He said, "It really was." I said, "I'm glad." He went to bed. I went to the second bedroom. I'd been sleeping there for a few weeks by then. Work stress, I told him, and I sat in the dark and sent Helen a text that said, "Move forward." The next 2 months were very quiet on the surface and very loud underneath. Helen filed. The credit line fraudulently taken in my name was flagged. The restaurant's operational accounts, which ran through a structure that included my original equity, were subject to review. My husband hired an attorney who sent aggressive letters. His mother called me twice, and both times I let it go to voicemail. His mother. That's worth saying a word about. She had never particularly liked me. Not in an obvious way, she was too polished for that. But it was in the small things, the way she talked about her son's vision without ever acknowledging that I had made it possible. The way she referred to the restaurant at a family dinner 6 months earlier as what he's built, he, singular. I had been sitting across the table. When the legal process began, she called my mother-in-law. She left a voicemail, I still have it, in which she said that I was destroying a family business out of spite, and that if I had any dignity I would let this go and support my son the way a wife should. I listened to that voicemail 4 times. Then I called my attorney and told her to make sure the letter about the forged signature was filed properly, with documentation. The thing that people don't always understand about financial fraud in a marriage is that untangling it is slow. It doesn't happen in a dramatic confrontation. There's no single moment where you look across a room and everything resolves. It's paperwork and waiting and more paperwork. It's sitting in a conference room across from your husband and his attorney while they try to minimize what the documents clearly show. It's your attorney saying quietly the signature is not hers. We have a handwriting analysis. It's watching the man you married look at the table instead of at you. My husband's attorney proposed a settlement. Return of partial funds, dissolution of my equity interest, a clean break. Helen called it insulting and told me I didn't have to take it. I didn't take it. What I wanted wasn't complicated. I wanted what I was owed, not revenge. I need to be honest about that because I know how these stories go, and I don't want to pretend I was some kind of hero in this. I was angry and hurt, and there were nights when I cried in Cassie's guest room until I fell asleep. But what I was fighting for was my money, my signature, my name on documents I had never agreed to. That felt like the minimum I was entitled to. The restaurant, Ember, had opened to good reviews but had not, as it turned out, opened to sustainable revenue. The first month was flush because of the opening press. The second month was harder. By the time the legal proceedings were underway, my husband was scrambling for operating cash. The line of credit he had fraudulently obtained was frozen as part of the dispute. He needed money to make payroll. He called me. Not through his attorney. He called my cell phone on a Wednesday evening, and when I answered he sounded like someone I used to know. He said the restaurant was going to fail if I didn't help. He said we could work this out between us. He said he was sorry. I asked him what, exactly, he was sorry for. He paused. Then he said, I'm sorry you feel like things were done behind your back. I'm sorry you feel, not I'm sorry you feel, not I'm sorry I did. I'm sorry you feel. I appreciate the call, I said. You can talk to my attorney. I hung up. The settlement we eventually reached was not everything. It's never everything, but it included return of a substantial portion of my principal investment, acknowledgement of the fraudulent credit line, which was his legal problem to resolve, not mine, and release of any claim he might have made against my separate accounts. His attorney also quietly dropped any counterclaims when the handwriting analysis on the forged signature became part of the formal record. I signed the final paperwork on a Tuesday morning. Cassie drove me. We went to a diner afterward, and I had eggs and coffee, and she didn't ask me how I felt because she knows me well enough to know that the way I feel about something takes a few days to surface after I've been in practical mode for months. What I want to say, and this is the part I have thought about the most, is that it was never really about the restaurant. The restaurant was the mechanism. What it was actually about was a slow, quiet process of someone deciding that my money was a resource they were entitled to, and my role in their dream was something to be managed rather than honored. Every time he said, "Trust me," he was counting on me not to ask the question underneath the question. Every time he redirected my attention, he was buying time. The exclusion from the opening wasn't the betrayal. It was the moment the betrayal became visible. I'm 33 now. I live in a one-bedroom apartment that is mine, that I chose, with plants on the windowsill and a kitchen I actually cook in. I've started rebuilding. Not from zero. I still had that account my mother's voice had convinced me to keep. But from less than I should have had to. From a place I didn't choose to be standing in. My mother asked me once, after it was all over, if I regretted saying yes to the investment. I thought about it for a while. I think what I regret is not asking harder questions earlier, not the love. I believed in that love and some of it was real, and I'm not going to retroactively pretend I was foolish for feeling it. What I regret is confusing trust with the suspension of common sense. You can love someone and still have a paper trail. You can believe in someone and still know exactly where your money is. Those two things are not opposites. I wish someone had told me that before I learned it the way I did. To anyone watching this who has been asked to just trust me by someone who can't show you a spreadsheet, I'm not saying don't trust people. I'm saying trust is not the same as documentation, and real partners don't ask you to choose between the two. I smiled when I signed those final papers. Not because I won. I didn't win anything. I got back something that was mine, but I smiled because it was over. And because I was sitting next to Cassie in a conference room with my attorney beside me, and because the version of me who had stood in that kitchen and laughed thinking he was joking, she deserved better, and I had fought to give it to her. That felt like enough. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, not obsessively. I'm past that stage, but in the quiet way you do when something has changed you and you want to understand exactly how, so it doesn't happen again. What strikes me most, looking back, is how gradual it was. There was no single moment where my husband became someone who would forge my signature on a legal document. It happened in increments. Each small decision he made to prioritize his comfort over my right to know. Each time he said trust me, instead of showing me the books. Each time I let it go because I loved him, and love felt like it should be enough to cover the gap. It wasn't one betrayal. It was 100 small choices, his and mine both, that built to something I couldn't walk back from. I think about that a lot when people ask me if I blame myself. The honest answer is, a little. Not for loving him. Not for believing in his dream. Those were real, and I don't regret them. But I let trust become a substitute for clarity. I let he wouldn't do that to me do the work that a paper trail should have been doing. That's on me. Owning that isn't self-punishment. It's just the truth, and I found that the truth, even the uncomfortable parts, is steadier ground than the story I was telling myself. What I learned is something I wish I could have understood earlier, before it cost me nearly everything I'd spent my 20s building. Your financial security is not separate from your integrity as a partner. Protecting your own money doesn't mean you don't trust someone. It means you respect yourself enough not to make yourself entirely dependent on another person's choices. Real partnership doesn't require you to disappear into someone else's vision. It makes room for both of you. Helen, my attorney, said something to me once, near the end of the process, when I was exhausted and the paperwork felt endless. She said, the people who take advantage of generosity are counting on you to feel guilty for defending yourself. And I realized she was right. Every time I had hesitated, every time I had almost asked the hard question and then pulled back, I had been, on some level, afraid that asking would make me look like I didn't believe in him. He had trained me to feel that way. Slowly, without me noticing, he had made accountability feel like betrayal. That's the thing I want to say most clearly, because I think it matters. Intelligence in a relationship isn't coldness. Asking questions isn't distrust. Knowing where your money is isn't unromantic. Cassie knew that. Helen knew that. My mother had tried to tell me. I had to learn it by losing close to $500,000 and a marriage before it finally landed. I'm not the same person I was when I wrote that first check. I'm more careful now, not more fearful, just more clear-eyed. I ask questions I used to let slide. I read documents before I sign them. I know the difference between someone who earns trust and someone who simply asks for it. What happened to me was not fair, but it made sense in the way that consequences always make sense when you trace them back far enough. The path that led to me sitting in Helen's office that first morning was paved with moments where I had the information I needed and chose not to look at it. That's not weakness, it's human. But it's also something you can change. I changed it. That feels like the most important thing I did.